Mr. Lawson, this courtroom isn't here to indulge sob stories. The words echoed across courtroom 4C like a slap. Judge Raymond Kerr didn't bother to hide his smirk as he leaned back in his leather chair, one hand tapping impatiently on the bench. Edward Ed Lawson stood at the defendant's table tall, but worn his back stiff with pain and the sleeve of his navy blazer neatly pinned where his right arm used to be. I served this country for 30 years. Your Honor, Ed said slowly, steadying himself on his cane, I'm only here because my benefits were delayed, and whose fault is that? Judge Kerr snapped, cutting him off. This court isn't your therapist. We're here to deal with contracts, not combat wounds. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Even the opposing attorneys, sharply dressed and flanked by glowing tablets, shifted in their seats. But Ed didn't flinch. He had stared down enemy fire in the jungles of Vietnam. He wasn't about to be broken by a gavel and a raised voice. I've paid my rent on time for 7 years, he said. This is the first time I've ever fallen behind, and it's because of an error at the VA. I have the documentation right here. All I'm asking for is time. Judge Kerr scoffed. You expect this court to force a private company to wait while your red tape untangles itself. Mr. Lawson being a veteran doesn't mean the rules no longer apply to you. No lawyer, no advocate. Just Ed one arm, one cane, and a lifetime of service, standing alone in front of a man who saw his sacrifice as an inconvenience. The courtroom fell quiet, but this moment didn't begin in that chamber. It began 3 months earlier when a glitch in the Veterans Affairs payment system halted Ed's disability benefits without warning. His calls went unanswered. Forms went missing. The automated letters came like clockwork, each colder than the last. And when the property management company, recently acquired by a faceless corporation, saw the delay, they filed for eviction with zero hesitation. Today's hearing wasn't supposed to be a battle. Ed had come armed only with truth and paperwork. He thought that would be enough. But now, under the cold fluorescent lights and the weight of a judge's indifference, he felt like he was back in the trenches, fighting for something he'd already earned. What Judge Kerr didn't know, what no one in that room expected, was that this wasn't the end of Ed's story. It was just the opening volley. The judge's pen hovered over the eviction order, his expression unreadable except for a hint of impatience. Mr. Lawson, unless you have something truly compelling to add, this court will proceed with the ruling. Judge Raymond Kerr tapped the folder with the back of his pen. You've admitted you're behind on rent. Your VA payment issue, while unfortunate, is irrelevant to the matter of breach. Edward Ed Lawson, standing at the defendant's table with one hand gripping his cane and the other sleeve of his blazer empty and pinned, opened his mouth to speak. But before he could utter a word, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom slammed open with a force that silenced even the whispers in the gallery. All eyes turned. A tall, imposing figure in full-dress uniform entered with measured purpose. Rows of service ribbons and medals gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. His stride echoed down the aisle like a drumbeat. Every uniformed bailiff instinctively stiffened. Permission to address the court. Your Honor, the man said, voice calm but commanding. Judge Kerr blinked. And you are General Marcus Dalton, the man replied evenly, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The name wasn't just known, it carried weight like an avalanche. The judge's eyes widened, then narrowed. General Dalton, what possible reason do you have for involving yourself in this proceeding? Dalton turned briefly to Ed, nodding with deep respect. I served with this man in Da Nang, 1972. He pulled me out of a crater after an RPG strike. I lost consciousness. He lost his arm. The general's voice dropped to a near whisper. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for him. The silence was thunderous. Ed looked stunned, almost uncertain if this was real. Sir? I didn't know you didn't need to, Dalton interrupted. You just did your duty. He stepped forward, handing a thick envelope to the bailiff who delivered it to Judge Kerr. Contained in that folder are 3 documents, a signed letter from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs confirming that Mr. Lawson's housing benefits were delayed due to a federal system transition, a legal opinion from the Department of Justice citing protections under the Service Member Civil Relief Act, and an executive directive from the Department of Housing and Urban Development confirming that this eviction violates federal statutes regarding disabled veterans. Judge Kerr's hands trembled slightly as he opened the file. Before he could speak, the courtroom doors opened again. A woman in a blue suit with a Homeland Security badge clipped to her waist entered briskly, followed by two men in dark suits with Department of Justice credentials visible on their lanyards. One carried a tablet, the other carried a briefcase. "Your Honor." The woman said, "I'm Deputy Director Angela Reyes from HUD. Our office received reports that this property management company, Marble Creek Housing, has conducted multiple unlawful evictions against disabled veterans nationwide. This case is now part of a broader federal investigation into systemic discrimination." The Evergreen Properties legal team, seated across the aisle, exchanged panicked looks. Their lead attorney rose halfway to object, but said nothing. It was clear the tide had shifted. General Dalton continued, "Mr. Lawson has lived in that apartment for 8 years, never missed a payment until your government failed him. Instead of compassion, he got condemnation. That ends now." Kerr swallowed visibly, his earlier smugness gone. "Your Honor," the lead attorney for Marble Creek finally said, rising to her feet, "my client would like to request a brief recess to confer." "No need," Dalton cut in. "There's a larger matter here. This isn't just about Edward Lawson. It's about every veteran treated like a burden after they've already paid the highest price." The judge glanced around the courtroom, where even the court reporter had stopped typing. Slowly, he set his pen down. "General Dalton, Deputy Director Reyes. This court will review all submitted documentation and delay ruling until further consultation with federal authorities. No, Your Honor." Dalton said, eyes unblinking. "There won't be a ruling. There will be a withdrawal and an apology." The judge opened his mouth to object, then paused, visibly calculating. At last he turned to Ed. "Mr. Lawson, given the information presented, the court will dismiss the eviction proceedings with prejudice. Your housing is secured." The courtroom erupted into quiet applause. A few veterans seated in the gallery nodded solemnly. Ed, speechless, simply stood in stunned silence. Dalton stepped forward and placed a hand on Ed's shoulder. "You served with honor. It's about time someone served you." Outside the courthouse, the scene spilled into national headlines. But inside that courtroom, something more powerful had shifted respect long overdue, had walked through the doors in full uniform and changed everything. Gasps still hung in the air from General Marcus Dalton's sudden intervention when the next shift began, one that would shake the courtroom far beyond its limestone walls. Judge Raymond Kerr, now visibly unsettled, adjusted his robes and cleared his throat. "This court appreciates your statement, General Dalton. However, unless the evidence directly affects the lease violation, it does," Dalton cut, in voice calm but unyielding. He motioned to the aide beside him, who stepped forward and handed over a sealed folder stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense. Contained within is confirmation that Mr. Edward Lawson qualifies under federal protections for disabled veterans, specifically under the amended provisions of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. This eviction not only violates federal guidelines, but also triggers mandatory federal oversight. Murmurs spread through the gallery like a wave. Even Sterling Holmes's legal counsel looked rattled, quickly reviewing their own notes. Furthermore, Dalton continued, "I've brought representatives from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They've been investigating a concerning trend involving Sterling Holmes' treatment of disabled and elderly veterans. This hearing merely exposed what's been festering beneath the surface." The courtroom doors opened again. A woman in a slate gray suit entered, accompanied by a staffer carrying a thick binder. She walked briskly to the front. "Your Honor, my name is Deputy Secretary Camille Linwood of HUD. We're submitting evidence today showing that Sterling Holmes has initiated eviction proceedings against more than 24 veterans within the last 18 months, many under similarly dubious circumstances. Most cited non-payment during benefit delays or system errors." Judge Kerr's gavel hit the block more out of desperation than control. This is still a state courtroom. "I'm not sure." "With all due respect," Linwood replied, "you may be presiding over the case, but you are not immune to federal law." She turned towards Ed, who sat frozen at the defendant's table. "And this man deserves not just justice, but dignity." It wasn't long before the first news camera poked through the double doors. Then another, and another. Word had already spread across the courthouse. A decorated veteran was being evicted for reasons exposed as illegal, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had just shut down the hearing. Within an hour, the clip was on Twitter, then TikTok, then CNN. The scene Judge Kerr being forced to listen as General Dalton recited the story of how Ed Lawson dragged him out of a burning helicopter was instantly iconic. How Honor Ed began trending nationwide. By afternoon, Sterling Holmes' headquarters in Chicago was flooded with calls, emails, and protest messages. Their PR team scrambled to control the damage, but it was too late. Former tenants began coming forward, sharing stories of quiet evictions, predatory contracts, and threats made during benefit disruptions. Veterans groups across the country issued public statements of condemnation. Then came the pressure from above. By the next morning, Sterling Holmes issued a public apology through a hastily arranged press conference. Flanked by red-eyed executives, CEO Darren Cross read from a teleprompter with clenched jaw and forced sincerity. Sterling Holmes deeply regrets the treatment of Mr. Edward Lawson and any other veteran who may have experienced similar hardship. Effective immediately, we are suspending all eviction proceedings involving veteran tenants. Furthermore, we are creating the Lawson Housing Initiative, a $5 million fund dedicated to supporting veterans facing housing insecurity. Back in Jefferson County, Judge Kerr had no choice. Court resumed at 10:00 a.m. sharp. This time, he entered with none of the swagger he'd shown the previous day. Having reviewed the newly submitted evidence and given the federal implications now in place, he said, without looking up, this court hereby dismisses the case of Sterling Holmes versus Edward Lawson with prejudice. All claims against the defendant are voided. Mr. Lawson is no longer under threat of eviction. There was no applause, just silence, a kind of reverence. General Dalton stepped forward once more, placing a hand on Ed's shoulder. You didn't just win your case, Ed. You cracked open a much bigger door. Ed, stunned, looked around the courtroom. He had expected to walk out homeless. Instead, he'd sparked a reckoning. The HUD team remained behind after court organizing follow-ups with other local veterans who had faced similar treatment. Federal investigators would spend the next several months unraveling the housing company's practices, using Ed's case as their benchmark. Outside the courthouse, cameras clustered as Ed was led to a podium. He didn't say much, just enough. I never asked to be a symbol. I just wanted to keep my home. He paused, glancing at the sea of microphones, and added, if what happened to me keeps it from happening to someone else, then maybe this old life still had a fight left in it. The crowd erupted, not just in cheers, but in something deeper, relief, admiration, hope. Edward Lawson wasn't invisible anymore, and the systems that had failed him had just been put on notice. The ripple effect of that courtroom moment did not end with the dropped gavel. Edward Ed Lawson sat quietly outside the courthouse that evening, still wearing the same navy blazer that had once been dismissed as irrelevant. But now, it bore the weight of national change. The apology from Sterling Holmes had made headlines, but it was just the beginning. By the following week, Ed received a formal invitation from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He was being asked to join a new civilian oversight committee tasked with investigating how administrative delays, payment errors, and housing insecurity were affecting thousands of veterans like him across the country. He hadn't sought a role in public service again, not after everything he'd endured, but something about the moment felt different now. Empowered. Mr. Lawson, the VA letter read, your experience, integrity, and poise under public scrutiny have inspired us. We believe your voice will help shape national reform for years to come. Ed accepted. When he arrived at the VA's Washington, D.C. headquarters for the first committee session, reporters gathered outside. Flashbulbs popped, but Ed ignored them. His focus was on the task ahead. General Marcus Dalton greeted him in the lobby with a firm handshake and a nod that carried quiet pride. You've done more than speak, Dalton told him. You've opened a door for others to walk through. Inside, Ed met fellow committee members, some former service members, others, family members of veterans, lost to homelessness or eviction. They didn't waste time. Within weeks, the committee had published a comprehensive report detailing systemic breakdowns across agencies and private housing networks, using Ed's case as the catalyst. Their findings sparked bipartisan hearings in Congress and mobilized multiple government agencies to begin reevaluating protocols. Meanwhile, under growing pressure from shareholders and regulators, Sterling Holmes underwent a complete internal audit. The results were damning. For years, the company, especially under the direction of its parent firm, Kelleher Capital, had quietly prioritized profit margins by streamlining eviction processes, with vulnerable veterans bearing the brunt. Sterling's public apology to Ed had been sincere, But the evidence of systemic negligence forced deeper reckoning. Facing calls for legal accountability and boycotts from advocacy groups, Sterling's board announced sweeping reforms. CEO Martin Kelleher resigned under pressure, and 2 veterans were immediately appointed to the company's executive team, retired Colonel Andrea Martinez and Navy Chief Petty Officer Devin Bryant. Their first act establishing an independent tenant protection division with authority to override eviction decisions involving any veteran senior or disabled tenant until federal review was complete. The announcement of these reforms came at a press conference where Ed, now a national figure, was invited to speak. He stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of reporters, service members, and citizens. "I never wanted fame," he said. "I just wanted fairness. This isn't just about me. This is about every veteran who's ever been treated like a burden instead of a brother. I hope what started in that courtroom becomes a standard across this country." Applause followed, but the real change was still unfolding behind the scenes. Courts across the country began reevaluating how they handled cases involving vulnerable populations. Judges received updated training on the Service Members Civil Relief Act. New procedural guidelines were distributed to all housing courts, emphasizing that eviction proceedings involving veterans required additional scrutiny and time for benefits correction. As for Judge Raymond Kerr, his days on the bench were numbered. Months after the hearing, amid mounting complaints and a petition signed by over 150,000 people calling for his resignation, Kerr quietly retired. His statement cited a desire to reflect on the evolving responsibilities of the judiciary, but the public knew better. His comments about veterans not deserving special treatment had become a rallying cry, not for dismissal, but for dignity. A stark reminder of how the bench is no place for bias cloaked in law. Ed, for his part, returned to his life with a new purpose. His apartment, once nearly taken, was now a place of quiet refuge, but also of momentum. Every week, he took calls from younger veterans navigating the system. He became a mentor again, this time not through war stories, but through bureaucratic mazes and legal protections. At the VA center near his home, he started an informal weekly meetup for veterans facing housing trouble. Some brought folders full of paperwork. Others just needed someone to listen. They called it Ed's Bench, named not after a piece of furniture, but the one they watched him stand tall from in court. By the first anniversary of that hearing, Ed had spoken at 5 law schools, 2 national veterans conferences, and 1 joint session of Congress. And yet, when asked by a young cadet what accomplishment made him proudest, Ed answered simply, "That I didn't walk out of that courtroom, that I stayed, not for me, but for who might come next." His Medal of Honor stayed locked in the same wooden case Sarah had chosen for him decades ago. He never wore it. But on his living room wall hung a new item, a framed printout of the first page of the federal training manual, now used in every VA housing case, its cover featuring a photo of Ed, seated hand on cane eyes, steady. Across the top, one bold title read, "Respect isn't granted, it's remembered." Months after helping reshape national policy, Edward Ed Lawson stood before a packed auditorium at the National Veterans Housing Conference in Washington, D.C., flanked by lawmakers. Military officials and advocates, Ed spoke not with outrage, but with resolve. His message wasn't fiery, it was clear. Justice, he said, voice steady despite the microphone's echo, isn't a favor granted to veterans. It's a duty owed. The room fell silent. He let the pause linger before continuing. "We didn't ask to be heroes. We asked to come home with dignity and to be treated as human beings, not case files, not burdens. Just people who gave what we had and now ask for what we earned." Applause erupted, but Ed raised his hand gently, signaling calm. He spoke about how one hearing in one small courtroom, filled with quiet humiliation, had turned into something far bigger than he ever imagined. "I'm not here because I'm special," he said. "I'm here because people chose to listen." Back home, Ed had made one change to his modest apartment. Above the mantel, where a faded wedding photo once stood alone, now hung a framed Medal of Honor, the one he had donated to a museum decades ago, recently returned with a handwritten note from General Dalton. "It belongs with you now, not behind glass." Ed had hesitated to display it, but Sarah would have wanted it there, visible, honored, and now every young veteran who visited him at Ed's bench saw that medal and understood what was possible when you refused to be silenced. He didn't stop there. Over the months, Ed spoke at universities, sat on oversight boards, and even advised law schools on veterans' rights. Everywhere he went, his message remained consistent: don't wait for someone to walk in and save you. Stand up, someone will see you. And many had. The reforms sparked by his courage had protected thousands, most of whom would never know his name. But that didn't matter to Ed. "I never did any of this for attention," he'd often say. "I did it because the system forgot us. And I remembered. True dignity isn't loud, it's steady. And sometimes the quietest stand becomes the most lasting legacy." If this story moved you, type "Justice's Duty" in the comments to honor Ed's message. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage, reform, and the heroes hidden in plain sight. Because the world changes not when we speak the loudest, but when we finally choose to listen.